Today, I'm going to talk about the sunk costs fallacy and how it's not a fallacy. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Okay, so if you don't know, the sunk costs fallacy, as it's called, is the idea that it's a thing that people do where you spend a bunch of time and effort or money, either as an individual or as an organization, in doing something, and you're not done yet, and you have to invest more time and effort, money, whatever, in order to see it to completion. And the idea is that people, if you can't recover it, like things like, if you can't sell off what you've already done. It's just unrecoverable. It is what it is. You can't get any benefit from it right now. And so what you should do at this point is not take into consideration any of that. You should only consider what is the return on the investment that you have to do for the time and money and effort right now. And to be a rational actor, you should only consider the present value or the present return on investment of the present expenditure, and that's it. And if you consider all of the effort and time you had already put into it, you are being irrational. Now, I should preface this with saying that there are times when you need to change course. There are times when you need to abandon something you've been doing. There are times when you need to just throw away things that happened in the past. Great example is if you build up a business that is immoral, you should just throw it out and start over, because when you repent, you shouldn't do that. So, if you've built up a brothel, or you've built up a business as an assassin or what have you, then you should just repent and throw that away. And it's a real pity, but you should move forward. Really trivial example. There are other things that aren't simply immoral. There are times when it's just a really bad decision to go forward. You should change and do other things. So that is a live possibility. However, it is not always the case that you should only consider things in the present without any regard to the past. Now, for a really simple way to see why that is the case, that you should not simply disregard the past, if you were to simply disregard the past, then all trials for crimes would be impossible to proceed with. So a person, murders 30 people, gets in a truck, drives through a crowd, kills 30 some odd people, and then, throws a bunch of bombs out the side too, killing 20 more. When you come to trial, the person then says, well, this is the sunk cost fallacy. You're prosecuting me for these murders. These are things that happened in the past, and this trial is not going to bring them back or anything. They're a sunk cost, so we should just move forward. And there's no value to society in me being in prison. I'm not going to contribute, as a useful member of society there, whereas if I'm not in prison, I'll have a job and so on, and I'll be a useful member. So it'd be completely irrational to, pay attention to what happened in the past, because the past is not right now. And this is obvious nonsense. I mean, if you accept it, then fine. But if you, if you're this kind of, inhuman person, then okay. But the point really here that you can see very clearly, merely saying that the past is the past and we're in the present, and you shouldn't consider the past in the present, is just dumb. Now, that's illustrating the point. That's not proving the point. To prove the point, let's look at, consider what we actually are. Or actually, before we do that, I'm going to give one more example. So suppose, if you were to just go along with this idea of the past is in the past and doesn't matter, we're not going to consider it, it would also be impossible in order to do things like fulfill contracts. I signed that in the past. I'm not signing it right now. The mere fact that I agreed to it back then shouldn't bind me to any actions at present. That's the past, not the present. Same thing, same disastrous consequences. You wouldn't be able to do any sort of contract. In general, if you hold that since promises happened in the past, they shouldn't be binding now, you will get that same terrible result of you'll have a very difficult time accomplishing anything because nobody will believe your promises. And this points to the problem that actually occurs within it. Now, I do want to consider for a moment, as I said, that's just another illustration. It's not any kind of proof. To see the kind of proof, you have to ask what it is we're actually doing. The rational actor hypothesis, or the rational actor of economics, is just a model. And, as the saying goes, all models are wrong, some models are useful. Is this a useful model in some circumstances? But only in some circumstances, and it most certainly is not a highly accurate map of reality. What actually is reality? We're in time. But time is even a little bit strange. As St. Augustine pointed out in the Confessions, it's actually a little bit weird. Like, the past, we're so used to it, but if you think about it for a moment, the past is gone and we can't get at it, except we can remember portions of it. And the future isn't here yet, so we can't get at the future at all. The only thing that we can have any effect on is the moment, but the moment's already turned into the past. It flies by in a fleeting way, and so what the heck even are we, really? I mean, what is our life? Our life is this fleeting moment that's we control, but it's so thin we can't even really notice it, and it's already gone. And so, if you really stop to think about it, it's really kind of strange. Well, so what is it? What is time? We are building up creation, moment by moment. So, this world is a temporary world. It is of its nature temporary. It's a world that enables all of us to take part in God's act of creation through the technical term being secondary causation, but I prefer to call it delegation. God delegates to us certain actions within creation and thus incorporates us into his creative action. And so what we are doing is moment by moment building up eternity. Once we're essentially in the prologue to real life. We are the prologue, pro from before and log from logos word, the words before the actual main part of the work. The main part is eternity, outside of time, where all being is completely actual and there isn't potential and there isn't change. We're building to that. That's what heaven is, and that's, by the way, why heaven is not boring. Because that critique, heaven sounds really boring. Now, I mean, the idea that hell is going to sound more interesting is idiotic. Just take a few moments to think about what people are actually like in practice, and to think about what life would be like if there is no repercussion for people simply being unlimitedly cruel. And if you think the parties will be good under those conditions where there's no such thing as the police and the bullies who are much stronger than you are can do whatever they want for as long as they want, and that sounds like fun, you're an idiot. But the critique that heaven sounds really boring, if heaven were a succession of changes in which nothing is particularly happening, yeah, it would be boring. Similarly, if heaven were a succession of changes like time is for us at the moment, building to nothing, where anything you are ever doing, where you're not, there's no fullness, there's no fulfillment of the promise, where all of these fleeting moments just constantly go by and you're not doing anything that builds to anything, all of it would be completely empty. This world only really makes sense as the build-up to something which is different, something which has its fullness, the fulfillment of the promise that we live in right at the moment. So, kind of, in a sense, clearly, although that's really not the right word to use at all for something that is admittedly speculative, heaven has a different nature than what right now does. And in some sense, we can describe it as eternity. It's a thing where there is at least fulfillment in heaven. The nature of heaven is fulfillment. Otherwise, everything is a lie, nothing means anything, you've got nothing but nihilism. So the two options are heaven is the fulfillment of what is promised now, or nihilism. Those are your two options, and there really aren't any others. And that, people who take medieval art too seriously and say heaven is banquet, as if it would be great to actually literally just be eating for 100,000 hours straight and still have an infinite number of hours of eating still left to go, and I guess occasionally use the bathroom or something. Or maybe you don't magically or whatever, but you just keep on shoveling food in without stop. That would actually not be all that great. So if you take medieval depictions of heaven as the fullness of it, it's does not work. It would in fact be boring. So that's why this world, this life, this temporary life that we are in is essentially the promise of something that will be fulfilled, and it is building up moment by moment something that actually will be. And thus it is the case that throwing out what has already been, throwing out what you've already done, is to take a portion of the time that you have been given and actually throw that out. Now, it may not be very economically advantageous to see through to completion something that you already started. You may have a somewhat better option. Now, where it's important to distinguish things. Now, I'm not saying that, like, if it turns out that you actually had a bad idea and the thing that you're building is could not work, well, you don't at that point need to see it through to completion anyway, because you can't see it through to completion. What you've got really is like a fundamentally wrong idea, and so unfortunately you already wasted the time, and there's nothing you can do to make this not a waste of time, because it couldn't go anywhere. And that's like what's described in the sunk cost fallacy. And it is important to, and the grain of truth that the sunk cost fallacy captures is that you need to be realistic about what you actually did in the past and how viable is this? How much can this actually do something? How much, and you do also need to be realistic. Like, you can't you can't fulfill the past. You can't forsake much greater good that you could do in the present simply to fulfill the past. So you have to weigh things prudentially, and this is a matter of prudential judgment. So you do have to weigh things and be realistic about what's available. I mean, I had a project to put together a collection of 4,719 toothpicks, all lined up perfectly in a row, and I've got 4,000 of them done, and I have the option of doing something really worthwhile. Like, I have the option of helping some people over here, but then I won't have put that arbitrary number of toothpicks together. Okay, this is a great place in which you need to be realistic, and that going over and helping these people is vastly better than having put together an arbitrary number of toothpicks just because. So there is something to be said for exercises in discipline, etc., etc. But that said, within this completely contrived example that's not as unrealistic as it could be, given some of the things people set out to do. Just look at video game achievements if you don't believe me. Some of them are as utterly pointless as laying 4,917 toothpicks together in a perfectly straight line. Anyway, so you do have to be realistic, and I'm not trying to say that people should be unrealistic or so on. But what I am saying is that there is an actual value to seeing to completion a thing that was promised in the past, or that you have spent time on in the past, because then you have brought it to being an actual thing that can then be fulfilled and take part in the ultimate purpose of what we're doing now, because everything we're doing now is a prologue. We're not put on this earth to make as much money as possible. We're put on this earth, and money is one of the tools we use to do the jobs that God gave us to do while we are here. So the big point here is that the problem with the sunk cost fallacy is assigning zero value to honoring the past. And the past is as much a part of our life as the present is. We can't get at it, but on the other hand, it is going to be a part of what is the fulfillment of what we are promising. And so it is worth investing additional time in order to make what happened before able to take part in that, in its fullness. So there are limits to this, of course, because you have to weigh the goodness of the whole thing versus the goodness of what you can do. But where the sunk cost fallacy really goes wrong is in just ignoring the value of the past. There are even very practical elements to this, by the way. Like, when I was looking up a few different people's definitions of the sunk cost fallacy, just to see how much variety there was in how it was defined. An example which I saw coming up was an example of the sunk cost fallacy being staying with a partner even though the two of you have problems, because you have already invested several years into them. Now, the thing is, this is actually a really terrible example of the sunk cost fallacy, because the human capacity to form new relationships is actually a very limited thing, and your ability to find decent people is itself a very limited thing. So assuming that we are talking about people who are, who are both reasonable and decent people who are having trouble getting along together, rather than like, your girlfriend is a drug addict and was a drug addict when you met her, and there's no way she's ever going to kick it because she loves drugs. And yeah, like, if the person that you picked was just a complete mistake from the outset, then yeah, the fact that you had been through this mistake for several, that you've been compounding this mistake for several years is not a reason to keep compounding the mistake further. That is to say, if there was nothing good there to begin with, and nothing good in any of the time that you put in, then yeah, there's nothing of value there to honor, and so staying with that person isn't of value. Now, I should point out, they use the weasel word, it's not really a weasel word, but yeah, they use the word relationship. And indeed, if this is, a dating relationship, if this is prior to marriage where you have made vows, well then, yeah, like if this was a mistake to have this person as your girlfriend or to have this person as your boyfriend, then you really should just fix that mistake now. Now, if you're married, that's not true at all, because you married a person, you entered into a different state of being, you are bound to this person while the two of you live, and the mere fact that like you've got problems now doesn't mean that that bond doesn't exist. And this gets back to the thing I said about promises too, although the bond is actually a change in the state, the nature of the person, but that's an additional point, and not necessary for the main point here. But as is much more frequently the case, that you and a person are having problems, and maybe you'd get along with someone better, but you've invested a bunch of years into this person already. There's actually a great deal of value in having invested several years into a person that you have, even as a practical value. Because you have gotten to know the person. There are various ways in which you know how to work with them. There are various ways in which they know how to work with you. There are all sorts of things that you have learned about the person, which are valuable as long as the two of you are trying hard to be good people to accomplishing this task of being good people to each other. And so if you have spent several years with the person, you're not merely looking at like, oh, there's the investment of time. There's actually a large accumulated set of knowledge that you have, very particular to just that person, which if you leave them will now do you no good, whereas it was doing you good beforehand and had the potential to do lots of good in the future, and B, will actually quite potentially trip you up with another person, because it's really hard for us to retarget from one human being to another. We can do it, and it takes time. But especially for intimate relationships, it's really, really easy to accidentally fall into assuming that all of the things that you learned about your previous romantic partner apply to the new one, and to get all sorts of things wrong and to misunderstand things that people say. Incidentally, a general problem that you can see with this is where people will try to have an argument with somebody else with you. If you've ever been on the receiving end of this, it's very confusing and very frustrating, where a person's talking to you and arguing about something you didn't say, and after a while you eventually figure out, okay, like this person really wants to have this argument with their father, but that's not working out, and something I said reminded them of their father, and so they're really hoping that they can win this argument with their father, but with me, and that doesn't work, because I'm not him, and yeah, this is... And I'm not talking about a romantic partner here, I'm talking about like friends or something. That sort of thing. If you've ever seen that, and a lot of people I think have, that same thing can very easily apply within romantic relationships. If you've been with a person in a romantic relationship for a bunch of years, it's going to be really hard actually to do a good job of not doing any of that with a new person. So it's not impossible, but it is a real problem that you will also face. So this is another thing that comes up within the context of the sunk cost fallacy. Having put time and effort into something it's not merely the time that you put in terms of like the prudential judgment that has to be developed. The time that you put in has taught you all sorts of skills and knowledge about the thing that you can use to benefit with that thing that you may well not be able to use elsewhere, or may even get in your way if you shift from that to something else. Now, I want to again say, I'm not saying don't change or don't take on new projects or anything stupid like that. Again, it's all prudential judgment, but the sunk cost fallacy ignores all of this value. The sunk cost fallacy is saying just treat all of this as if the value of this is zero, as if the value of the time that you had put in is zero because it's in the past, and also that all of the knowledge that you gained particular to the thing that you can use to extract greater value from it is also zero. And so that's where the sunk cost fallacy really goes wrong. At its really extreme versions, and occasionally it is used as extreme versions, sometimes more mild, sometimes completely reasonable versions. It's all over the place, and I'm only really talking about the worst versions of this. It is both dishonoring the past and also an attempt to simply ignore the reality of how things work and how things like learning works and how complicated and rich the world actually is. Because what the sunk cost fallacy, when it's pushed to its extremes, what it's trying to do is to say the world is actually very simple. You don't need to take into account things like the particular knowledge of, or the knowledge of particulars. That doesn't matter. Don't worry about that. Just think of it in broad strokes. Just think of it in big generalities. And that is the recipe for not being happy in life. Because happiness is always particular. Happiness always comes from particulars. You are not happy. You're happy in a particular experience. You're happy. It is a particular sunset that is beautiful. It is a particular tree that is beautiful. It is a particular song that is beautiful. It is a particular joke that is funny. And you have to... You're all happiness within this world. And you're not supposed to repose in happiness within this world. That's not what this world is about. Like, you're supposed to repose from time to time. Hence, like the cyclicality of the week, for example, in which there's a day of rest for human beings, and rest meaning things including like contemplation and being reposing in happiness. So, and we sleep every night. I mean, like, we're meant to periodically repose. We're not meant to continually repose. We're not meant to be happy in that sense of like entertained all the time. And so you don't want to repose in that. But to the degree that we should, the way you are happy in that sort of sense is always in particular. And the more that you live in generalities, the less happy you are going to be in that sense. This is related, by the way, to the extremely valuable skill in this world of being able to appreciate goods that you've already seen. If you want to be happy in this world, in the sort of way that you're supposed to be happy within this world, you want to develop the skill of being able to laugh at a joke you've already heard. You want to develop the skill of being able to see the beauty in a beautiful thing you've already looked at. Because constant novelty is too expensive for everybody, and even constant novelty eventually wears out because you start to see the similarities between all of the new things. And if you can't keep yourself focused on the particulars and instead retreat to generalities, even novelty will cease to be stimulating because you will start to recognize all of the patterns and all of the stuff, and eventually you'll get bored of it if you can't focus. You can't, it really doesn't matter, like, as you go through the decades, like, if you're 20, it can seem like life could always be new, and you'll always be traveling to different places and meeting new people. And, as the decades go on, what you'll actually discover is that new people are going to be much the same as the old people, except in the particulars. Each person is different in their particulars, but if you're not paying attention to the particulars, then people are much alike. And, you'll meet a bunch of different types, but eventually, like, there's not that much new under the sun. And you're going to find they're actually kind of similar until you start to really look at the particulars. But if you're looking at the particulars, you can look at the particulars of a person that you've known all your life. You don't need to have just met them to look at the particulars. It's the skill of being able to focus on the particulars that is where you're going to be able to find that kind of happiness that's appropriate to this temporary world. And so it is... generalities are extremely useful. I mean, I've got a master's degree in mathematics. Believe me, I like generalities. At the same time, abstractions and so on. At the same time, That's not where life is supposed to be lived for the most part. The abstractions are supposed to help you to appreciate the specifics. They're not meant to like distract you from the specifics. And at the end of the day, that's really the problem with the sunk cost fallacy as it occurs in a lot of examples and the way a lot of people use it. Can be used legitimately, but the way a lot of people use it is not the legitimate way, which is to be an excuse to not look at the particulars, to not appreciate the particulars, to not think about the particulars, to just ignore them and set yourself free of the particulars and escape into generalities, which is the opposite of what will make you happy. Generalities should be used to appreciate and understand particulars. They should not be used to escape from the particulars. And so that's why the sunk cost fallacy isn't really a fallacy. It's because, some of the time you shouldn't, you shouldn't continue what you have done in the past. So again, just want to be really clear. I'm not saying you should always keep doing what you've done in the past. That would be idiotic. But rather that the sunk cost fallacy, as I've seen it often applied, is trying to take refuge in generalities so you don't have to deal with the messiness of particularity. And that is a recipe for not being happy. Sometimes worse things. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of like gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.